What is up, everyone? Boshi here, back at it in Raid Shadow Legends, and we just found out we are getting those two new Doom Tower bosses this rotation. Let's jump into it. Alright, so yes, you heard correctly. The two new Doom Tower bosses that they discussed in their What's Next for Raid video, they're coming in the next rotation. So next rotation of Doom Tower is in about a week. So I wanted to get this video out to you guys so you guys can start, theory crafting on what champions you want to use in preparation for all this. We still have the champion training going on, so this is kind of a good time if you're looking at possibly leveling a specific champion for these encounters and stuff. The kits are a little interesting, I will say. I'm not exactly sure of what strategy I'm going to go with. The first boss has somewhat of a strategy going into it. If you look at the way it's worded and whatnot. The second boss, on the other hand, is kind of a weird anomaly type of boss, in my opinion. But yeah, let's go ahead and go through their kits and everything, and let's have that discussion. Let me know down in the comment section below what your ideas are on this, though, by the way. I would be very interested in what you guys are looking at using. So I have the kit over here. I'll throw everything up on the screen like normal. There is a lot of text to these abilities and passives and stuff like that, so I will try to fit everything on the screen in a normal size, but we'll see how that goes. So on the very first boss, his name is going to be Iragoth, and this is going to be the dragon boss. So the dragon boss, on the A1, Spike Storm attacks all enemies, places a block cooldown skill debuff for 1 turn. Nothing too horrible. The block cooldown skills does go along with the rest of his kit, though. So let's go on to the A2. Spirit Rush attacks all enemies, inflicts bonus damage for every turn remaining on all enemy skills cooldowns. It gets plus 20% damage for each turn of cooldown, and then places a fear debuff on enemies with no skills on cooldown. And this is on a 3-turn cooldown itself. So this boss is all going to be based on putting your allies' skills on cooldown and then increasing the damage done because of that. So right off the bat, you're going to probably want to run champions that don't have too long of cooldown skills, stuff like 5 or 6 turn cooldowns, and typically when you get into that range of cooldowns, it's very like res like type cooldowns. So yeah, it's going to be a very interesting one. On the A3, we have a Soul Burst, attack all enemies, puts all enemy skills on cooldown, and then fill Iragoth's turn meter by 5% for every turn remaining on all enemy skills cooldown. And this is on a 3-turn cooldown as well. So yeah, this is pretty big, right? He's probably going to prioritize this ability, I'd imagine. So putting everything on cooldown is pretty major. Luckily and typically, your enemy or your team is going to go first before this boss will get a turn, so you'll at least get one of your cooldowns off before he puts everything on cooldown. But the strategy is going to be probably putting his skills on cooldown, and we'll get into that in just a second. On the A4, which is his first passive, is Conjured Souls. Summons 3 minions at the start of the turn, 1 Eternal Priest and 2 Eternal Guards. Iragoth can have a maximum of 3 minions in battle at any time, and then places an Eternal Rage buff on Iragoth for 2 turns of only if only 1 minion is summoned or no minions are summoned by the skill. This buff cannot be removed or blocked. And what the Eternal Rage buff does is it increases Iragoth's speed and causes Iragoth to ignore unkillable, block damage, shield buffs, and ignores 50% of the target's defense when attacking. So what I gather from this specific ability or passive is the fact that you're gonna want to kill at least 2 of the adds. I'm gonna say all the adds, and that just it goes into his next passive I'm going to talk about in a second. But yeah, you're going to want to pretty much kill all 3 of his adds. We'll get into the adds abilities as well. I'm sorry, there is a lot with this boss, so I apologize for that. But yeah, so that is going to be on a 5-turn cooldown of him actually summoning the minions. So you have a decent amount of time before he continuously summons. So on his next passive, it's called Consume Soul. So Conjure Soul and then Consume Soul. At the start of the turn, sacrifice an Eternal Priest, which resets the cooldowns of Iragoth's skills and grants an extra turn. So obviously, you're gonna want to kill the priest if anything out of those. But then you're also going to want to kill the guards, because if there are no eternal priests on the team, Iragoth will sacrifice an Eternal Guard and heal Iragoth by 15% of his max HP. And it states that this skill will be on a 4-turn cooldown at the start of the battle and will activate and go on cooldown every 5 turns, even if there are no priest or eternal guards. So this ability is always going to go on cooldown no matter what, even if he doesn't have anything to sacrifice, which is pretty good. You don't want him to like finally get to summon something or have that ability off cooldown randomly. So you can at least speed tune your team in the sense that you'll know when this ability is going to be going on cooldown. And then we'll go into his other passives. Total, he has 4 passives, but these are kind of the standard ones that you would see on these Doom Tower bosses. So first you have Almighty Strength, which damage from skills that scale based on the enemy max HP cannot exceed 10% of the boss's max HP. I'm sure people are still going to be using something like Cold Heart or Septimus and stuff to deal damage, but that a passive is going to be standard on him. And then we have Otherworldly, which makes him immune to stun, freeze, sleep, provoke, block cooldown skills, fear, true fear, decreased speed, poison, and heal reduction. He's also immune to HP exchange effects, HP balancing effects, and turn meter reduction like every dragon. But they did make a note of he's not immune to cooldown increasing effects. So this is pretty much where uh, things are gonna, like, where the strategy comes into play, right? So he's not immune to cooldown increasing effects, which is pretty big. The fact of the matter is, when it comes down to that, I'd imagine you can put his skills on cooldown, from what I'm reading at least. Maybe I'm misunderstanding this, so please let me know. But because he's not immune to cooldown increasing effects, I'd imagine you can put his skills on cooldown. The very first thing comes to mind is stuff like Warlord, if you're lucky enough to have him, possibly putting all skills on cooldown. There's also Senesha's A2, I believe, which puts the target's skills on cooldown. And so I think this is going to be the way to do so. But depending on if those work, otherwise you're going to have to look at things like maybe Basher, where it increases the cooldown of things. But yeah, because I'm not seeing where he's immune to putting skills on cooldown. So it should work, I'd imagine. But yeah, so I think that is going to be the way around this boss specifically. But let's jump into his adds skills really quick, because those are actually kind of important. So first we have the Eternal Priest. So on the A1, attack one enemy, places a block cooldown skills debuff for 2 turns. And then the passive on the Priest is resets the cooldowns of all enemies' skills when this champion is killed by an enemy. This is pretty major. Another big reason why you're going to want to kill the priest is the fact that it's going to put everything off of cooldown on your team, which is pretty major. As long as you're going before Iragoth again, you don't want him to possibly just put everything back on cooldown. But yeah, and you don't want him getting sacrificed in order to do that for him. So definitely kill priest as priority number 1. And I know everyone's thinking, oh, it's going to be easy, you just AoE down all the ads. Well, there is a little bit of an issue with that, and that's because of the Eternal Guard. So the Eternal Guard has an A1 of attacking all enemies and placing a decreased defense for 2 turns, and also placing a provoke debuff for 1 turn on enemies under a block cooldown skill. Debuff, pretty big though. You don't want the decreased defense, and you possibly might be under block cooldown skill due to Iragoth's A1 being the ability that places that. But the big kicker with this is Eternal Protection, his passive, or the 2 guards passives. decrease the damage taken by allies from AoE attacks by 75%. So as much as I would say, hey, just AoE him down, that might not be possible at the higher end of this boss. I could see this possibly being done on the lower end bosses just because they might not have a lot of health. But on the higher Doom Tower or harder Doom Tower, um, that's going to be an issue. So you're going to want single target damage in order to kill these ads. And the big thing with this is like you're going to have to kill them within a rotation, because once he summons them, he's going to start sacking them with his passive, either resetting his cooldown, which granted, I think if anything, you should be able to at least kill the priest within one rotation of your allies. You're going to want to at least kill one guard because of his other passive, where he will gain that buff if he doesn't summon two or more of his allies when he eventually gets around to doing that again. But yeah, so it's going to be a little bit of an issue in the sense of needing to AoE. So you're probably going to want a lot of single target damage, in my opinion. But yeah. So overall, though, I think this boss is going to be pretty interesting. Like I said, it might turn out to be an easy boss like the current Magma Dragon right now, because Magma Dragon, if you have a provoke champion that can consistently keep provoke up, it makes the dragon boss fight very trivial, because all you have to do is worry about keeping that taunter up. With this boss, if you can continuously keep everything on cooldown, then you won't have an issue. You can pretty much just deal with his A1, which possibly will put block cooldown skills on you, but it's only going to be for one turn, I believe. Yeah, it's only for one turn. So yeah, depending on how or what skills are going to be usable on him, like I said, it doesn't say he's immune to getting things put on cooldown, and he's definitely not immune to cooldown increasing effects. So I believe this should work. But yeah, we'll see how that goes. Yeah, let's go on to the next boss. So the next boss is Grythion. So Grythion is going to be an interesting fight. I'm not exactly sure where I'm gonna go with this fight. So yeah, definitely let me know of your ideas down below. But yeah, so on the A1 we have Shockwave. Attack one enemy, has a 100% chance of placing a fear debuff for one turn. Not too bad. Fear debuff does suck, but it's not true fear, so it will not put your skill on cooldown if you try to use it, which is nice. We have the A2 Rock Smash. Transfer all debuffs from Grythion to each enemy, then attacks all enemies. Fills Grythion's turn meter by 5% for each debuff transferred. And this is on a 3-turn cooldown. Pretty much you're going to want to keep your debuffs down to a minimum because of the whole transfer and the turn meter fill. You don't want the boss taking more turns, and you'll see why in just a little bit. So yeah, you're gonna probably want to keep your debuffs down to a minimum on this boss. On the A3, you're also going to want to keep your buffs down to a minimum on this boss, because on the A3 we have Death Gust, removes all buffs from all enemies, then attacks all enemies. The buff removal cannot be resisted, so resist is not going to be a factor in this, and damage increased by 10% for each buff removed. Definitely don't want to deal with that. That's also on a 3-turn cooldown, so you're going to want to keep your buffs down to a minimum, and your debuffs down to a minimum, which is why I think this fight's going to be a little odd, because you usually use your buffs and debuffs to either obviously do damage more, or do more damage, sorry, or survive more. While this is going to be a little bit interesting because they're actually going to hurt you more than help you. So then on the A4 we have Divine Strike, which is his first passive. Attack an enemy whenever their HP drops below 50%. This attack places a 100% heal reduction debuff for 2 turns. So this is pretty big. Obviously you do not want him doing this, because once you drop below 50%, then you're worrying about healing. Well, then you have a heal reduction. So the big thing with this so far, while reading through his kit, I'm thinking of a cleanser. Doom Priest is going to be perfect for this in my opinion, because if you do have to have a debuff champion, which typically you're going to have at least a couple debuffs on your team, when he does the transfer, you are going to be able to cleanse it off with Doom Priest. You're going to get that passive heal from Doom Priest, which is nice. So trying to keep everyone above the 50% can take off that heal reduction if someone does drop below. I was also thinking of the leech debuff, but obviously you kind of don't want leech to be transferred to you to heal your enemy. Or you can think of people in lifesteal gear. So lifesteal gear, I think, is going to be one of the ways to go with this. Keeps everyone healthy. You don't have to depend on the leech debuff and stuff like that. So yeah, we'll see about that. His next passive is going to be Celestial Bond. This is what is going to be a little bit odd about this fight. So, Celestial Bond adds 1 Sky Bond buff to Grythion at the start of each turn. Also adds 1 Sky Bond buff to Grythion whenever an enemy's HP drops below 50%. Each Skybond buff increases Grythion's attack by 5%, crit rate by 3%, crit damage by 5%, and speed by 2.5. And then he will ignore shields, block damage, and unkillable buffs when Grythion has 10 or more Skybond buffs, and it can stack up to 20. These buffs cannot be blocked or removed. So this is pretty big. This makes me think of a DPS fight, like a damage check pretty much to make sure that your team can do enough damage. The big thing with this, though, it depends on the current stats of Grythion when going into the fight, right? Because if they're adding 5% increased attack, crit rate by 3%, crit damage by 5%, and speed by 2.5, then I'm like, my guess is that his base stats are going to be pretty low, but you're going to want to obviously get to the point of defeating him before he gets too many of these stacks, because I think he'll just out damage at a certain point or outspeed your team. And obviously you can't go the unkillable route, because once he gets 10 stacks he just starts ignoring that type of stuff, so prevents that way of killing him. Then he has a couple more passives. I'll throw them all up on the screen, but the big one is going to be Fair Wind. So whenever Grythion's turn meter is decreased, the turn meter of all enemies will be decreased by the same amount. Places a stun debuff for 1 turn on enemies with a fully depleted turn meter. Whenever an enemy's turn meter is filled, Grythion's turn meter will be filled the same amount. Turn meter increases are tracked and counted individually for each enemy. And then he has all the other passives from all the other Doom Tower bosses: Almighty, Immunity, immune to stun, freeze, sleep, provoke, block cooldown skills, fear, true fear, also immune to HP exchange effects, balance effects, and cooldown increasing effects. And then you have Almighty Tolerance, decreases damage done by poison debuffs by 90%. Almighty Strength, damage skills scaled based off of enemy max HP cannot exceed 10%. And Almighty Persistence is the last one. All turn meter reduction effects are decreased by 50% when used against this boss, which you were probably steering away from turn meter because of his other passive called Fair Wind, which means, you know, all turn meter stuff is going to be messing with your team as well. So yeah, pretty much in my eyes, or at least from reading this kit initially, it looks like it's going to be a DPS race, but based off of pure damage, right? Because of the whole Fair Wind, you don't want to increase your turn meter too much, because it's just going to increase Grythion's turn meter. You can't really decrease his turn meter because it's going to decrease your turn meter, so it's counteractive pretty much, or remains everything balanced or fair, hence the passive's name. And yeah, and then you obviously don't want him getting too many Celestial Bond passive stacks, because he will go out of control. So this one's going to be a little bit of an interesting fight. I don't know exactly how I'm going to go about this, because you do want some debuffs. You would like to have buffs, but buffs almost seem like they're going to hurt you more than help you with his A3. And yeah, so it's going to be a big thing. I think at least one cleanser is going to be pretty big. I think a passive healer like Syl or Doom Priest is going to be pretty big, just for keeping everyone up. You don't want your people dropping below 50%, which is where I think Lifesteal might come in handy. But yeah, all this is going to, you know, translate into something. I'm not exactly sure how that boss is going to go about being defeated. I think maybe if you just have a lot of big hard hitters, that might just be where it is. But you can't use too many. Like, you can use your max HP champions, On the lower levels, I think it'll do fine. Higher levels might run into a bit of an issue. We will see. It depends on how the boss's base stats are, though, before he gets too many Celestial Bond stacks. But yeah, so yeah, that is a lot to take in, guys. I'm sorry for all the ranting and whatnot. I just wanted to kind of get these kits out there for you guys to let you know what is going on with the Doom Tower bosses coming out, because it's coming out with next rotation. So you guys can start strategizing. Let me know what you guys are thinking about leveling, or champions that you think are going to be key in some of these situations. From my understanding, I think Iragoth is the one that has like a true strategy possibly behind it, with the increased cooldown skills and stuff like that. The boss Grythion is, in my opinion, it's like a very basic fight, but also I think there you might run into issues if you don't think everything through. Um, we don't know if there's going to be any new artifacts with these bosses. I'd imagine they should be dropping unique artifact, like unique materials, and so it should be a new artifact set for both of these bosses, but we have not been told that as of yet. But yeah, let me know what you guys think. Let me know what you guys are strategizing. Let me know if I should be leveling something during my champion training event, and I will talk to you guys in the next one. See ya.